we should wait a minute or two before we start, but I'll start to ask everyone really warmly welcome, and of course our eminent speakers. We have Brian Motherway, who will start. We have Christiane Ecker, who will speak about the Energy Efficiency Watch, and we have Daniel Becker also about the Energy Efficiency Watch project. We are very excited to have this seminar because we are trying to, let's say, merge the outcomes and the findings from two different projects. One is the Energy Efficiency Watch, which really looks at both let's say trends and views on energy efficiency, and based on that we are working to create strong energy efficiency narratives that can be used to forcefully communicate the issue about climate protection and the sustainable energy transition. We're also, although we don't have any presentation from that project, we're also bringing in some ideas and some thoughts from our recently closed multiple benefits of energy efficiency project, where we have looked at the multiple benefits of energy efficiency. And one thing with the multiple benefits is, of course, as a conceptual approach, I think we all agree it's a very good thing. There needs to be some quantification. We are not going to discuss this here, but it's also, again, a matter of narratives and of the viewpoint. How do we communicate this issue?
Article 2 and afterwards regarding Article 3.
Can you all please mute if you are not speaking, because it's quite disturbing. So thank you. And anyway, we are going to merge these things and see how we can move forward. We hope we will have some good discussions afterwards. Then I think that's up to all of you who participate. Feel free to have your camera on, but still muted if you want to. Some of our speakers feel they're a bit yeah, they like to speak to real faces, so that's good. I also want to inform you about two different things. One is that we are recording this seminar, so you all know that you are being recorded. I think you all get a kind of a warning screen on your yeah, a little pop-up window on your screen to show that we are recording. That's because we want to actually publish this, make it available online. We have had several requests. Then we are also going to, in the discussion, since we are so many, we can't have people asking questions directly with a microphone. So please ask your questions through the chat and we will convey them to the speakers. So the speakers will give their presentations according to the schedule, and then we will have we will open up for a few clarifying questions. But please save the big discussion till after all three presentations. So we'll have half an hour of discussion with a panel, and feel free then to come in and ask more questions. Yes, I think we are about. We are. Yeah, let's start. Nina says it's really hard to somehow she can't force mute individuals. Apparently, for some reason she can only mute all, and that's not good. So please mute yourself, apart of course from the speaker, which we do not want to be muted. And I think it's about time to start. And Nina, would you start sharing the presentation of Brian? I am very, very pleased to welcome Brian Motherway. Brian is the head of the Energy Efficiency Division at the IEA. And we think that IEA has turned into a super interesting and strong proponent of energy efficiency in the last 6 or 7 years. Gradually, it's always been, but you go from step to step. I'd say from clarity to clarity in communicating and analyzing energy efficiency. And you will give us some insights based on, of course, on your most recent reports, the IEA and EE Outlook and the energy efficiency report that came in the autumn, and also some more of your thoughts. So Brian, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Niels, and thanks also. It's a pleasure to share the event today with Christiane and Daniel and Niels and colleagues. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for joining. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot about the projects you mentioned, Niels, and thanks for the invitation to give an overview, which I think sets the context in terms of where we are on energy efficiency, including some recent developments. And I always start by saying it's a very dynamic time for conversations around efficiency, decarbonization, net zero targets, huge momentum in terms of setting of net zero targets, a lot of interesting conversations at COP, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But let's start with the bottom line. And Nina, if you show the next slide, please. The bottom line is CO2 emissions are increasing, not decreasing. Not only are we not decreasing fast enough, but actually 2021 saw one of the biggest single year increases in CO2 in several decades. Related to energy. So we are very far from the promise and the aspiration we're seeing in many net zero discussions we're seeing recently, and that's clearly of great concern. In the next slide, you can see where efficiency plays in that mix. 2020 was a disturbed year for very understandable reasons, and not one to really kind of dwell on emotionally or analytically. In 2021, we saw intensity gains, using that as a measure of efficiency progress, return to the decadal average. So we saw that in 2021, the global economy improved its energy intensity by just under 2%, which is about what it did on average over the last decade. You can take that as good news because it was much better than 2020, or you can also note that looking at our IEA net zero scenario, we need very quickly to be at double that rate. We need to double the global progress rate on energy intensity, not in a decade, not in 2 decades, but now and for this decade. Next slide, please. In 2021, we saw a little bit of progress on investment in energy efficiency. We saw very little progress in industry, which is something we're going to focus on today. We saw some progress in the transport sector, driven by investment in infrastructure and some stimulus spending. And we saw the biggest increase in the building sector. And that's driven by policies in certain key areas, including the upscaling of policy in and action and investment consequentially in Germany, also in US, few other countries. It's not a global trend. The global trend for efficiency investment is not particularly positive, apart from a few exceptions, which are reflected here in this graph. So that brings us then to what we need to do in the coming decades. And the next slide, you can see just some of the work we've been doing in the IEA, which I'm sure many of you have seen, around a pathway to net zero energy systems by 2050. There's more than one way to get to net zero. This is not the only way, but it's illustrative of the huge number and extent of measures that have to be taken in all sectors, across all economies, across all parts of the world, if we are to have any chance of getting to net zero by 2050. It starts now. The first decade is absolutely crucial. And the most crucial element in the first decade is energy efficiency. Let me say very clearly that I personally can't imagine any pathway to net zero by 2050 that's feasible, affordable, or plausible if it's not led by energy efficiency. We really need to drive down emissions quickly so that we don't lock in emissions, that we leave some emission space for the coming decades. But also, of course, energy efficiency makes everything else cheaper and more doable because it lowers the total size of the energy system compared to the counterfactual. It lowers the amount of money we need to invest in renewable supply, in infrastructure, in new technologies. And of course, if we don't act now, if we don't strengthen policies and investments now, every car that's sold, every building that's built, every washing machine that's sold is needlessly inefficient and is locked in for years and decades in some cases, locking in lower levels of efficiency and higher levels of emissions that will then have to be compensated somewhere else in the global economy. So leading with energy efficiency is really crucial. And of course, everybody on this call knows that efficiency can do that. Efficiency can step up to that demand because we know that there's a lot of available actions, a lot of available technologies, there's a lot of mature, cost-effective technologies ready for deployment now. And we need to focus on action now. And I think, you know, sometimes when we talk about 2050, when we're all of us are in this business long enough to think, we think in terms of decades and all that, but this is no longer about decades. This is about 2022, it's about 2023. Action really needs to accelerate, and it needs to accelerate now.
Can all please mute? Not
Thanks.
you, Brian.
No problem, Niels, thank you. Let's go to the next slide, please, Nina. So if we start with energy efficiency, and if we lead a net zero journey strongly, starting today with efficiency actions, by 2030, we could see a very different global energy economy. We could see GDP having risen by more than 40%, but total energy use actually having gone down. And that's because it's driven by major gains in all sectors. We see actually a potential for transport, energy use and buildings use in 2030 to be lower today, despite all the growth in those sectors, you know, growth driven by economic activity, by wealth creation, by new infrastructure spend. We see industry still slightly going up because it's driven by the large sectors like steel and concrete and that are still driving development in many parts of the world. But we see a major gain in energy intensity. We see the economy could, if all actions are taken, if all technologies are deployed, be literally 1/3 more efficient in intensity terms by the end of this decade, 1/3 less intensive in carbon terms. We do see growth in electricity because our net zero scenario looks a lot at the twin early imperatives around efficiency and electrification. And we know that electrification brings efficiency gains in itself, but of course it then allows us to make use of the faster progress we're seeing in renewable penetration in wind and solar in most parts of the world. We're seeing faster progress, as you know, in clean energy supply and electricity than in any other sector. Next slide, please, Nina. So just taking that to industry momentarily, we see that we could see major CO2 intensity reductions coming very quickly, starting this decade and getting towards net zero in 2050. That's driven by energy intensity gains, in other words, efficiency improvements. There's a lot of electrification going on in industry, as I mentioned, and that's another reason to focus on efficiency because it limits the amount of new build we need in terms of supply, transmission and distribution of electricity to meet that electricity growth. I do want to mention that we often talk about the very big sectors like steel, chemicals, cement, and et cetera, and that's because they make up the bulk of demand. But our analysis shows because those sectors have received more focus, more attention in terms of policy and technology innovation, actually the bulk of the efficiency gains, particularly in the first decade, are in the vast other sector of light industry. So in the larger number of smaller energy users, in all parts of the world, we see bigger gains where, of course, efficiency doesn't get nearly enough attention for understandable reasons. And I'm sure that'll be discussed further in this meeting today. So next slide, please, Nina, and let me turn to COP. I was at COP for a few days. It was my first time on a plane for nearly 2 years. It was my first time meeting human beings to talk about energy and climate, which was quite pleasant. I'm sure we'll discuss whether people think was COP, how successful COP was, the different dimensions of it. Happy to discuss it further. I think there was a lot of very positive news. Just remember that 2 years ago, not a single country in the world had a serious net zero target looking towards the dimension of 2050 or a little bit after. Now, something like 70% of global emissions are covered by a net zero target of one shape or another. We'll discuss how meaningful they are, how firm they are, but I think we really need to acknowledge there has been some very significant progress, at least at the level of aspiration and commitment. The Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda is one dimension where I think there's a lot of interesting, you know, sectoral dimensions, because it's one thing setting a global target, and I said at the start, we're not seeing that reflected in emissions trajectories yet, but looking into the more sectoral detail is where you see firmer action commitments, firmer implementation pathways, and I think that's where a lot of the more important conversations should be. Next slide, please. Speaking very broadly, our analysis of what was pledged at Glasgow. So I'm including the Glasgow breakthroughs here. I'm including the methane pledge, which I think was very significant, the new agreement between China and US, and some of the other pledges, including what I'll mention in a minute. We see that turning down the temperature trajectory quite significantly, but still nowhere near net zero. So not only do we need to see the implementation of all of the commitments we're seeing, but even all the commitments where they fully delivered don't take us to net zero. Still a lot of work to do, both in terms of scale of ambition and of course, delivery of that ambition. Next slide, please, Nina. And let me mention one thing that I was very pleased to be part of at COP, which was the Super Efficient Appliance Deployment Initiative, COP26 Product Efficiency Call to Action. This is led by the United Kingdom as COP president, involving the leaders of the C group, which includes India, European Commission, US, and other governments, Sweden as well. We're very pleased to be working with them at the IEA to drive efficiency gains in products, by which I mean the main technologies that this is focused on around motors, lighting, refrigeration, and air conditioners. Between them, those four technologies use 40% of the total global electricity demand. So they're very significant, and we're very pleased to see many major governments committing to dramatically increasing efficiency and ambition for those technologies in this decade. And I think that could have a lot of significant positive impact. Next slide, please. So Niels, you mentioned multiple benefits at the start. I'm looking forward to hearing that discussion in this meeting today. We think this is really important. We think it's really important to talk about efficiency in the wider sense. That's more salient for governments, for citizens, for society, for industry. And so measuring and articulating dimensions such as job creation, lower bills, lower air pollution, all of these dimensions are really important. There's a bit of a paradox in the multiple benefits of energy efficiency. Because it touches on all these domains, it means that it cuts across many policies. So energy efficiency is a governance challenge, if I can call it that, which means it's hard to deliver at a government or societal level, because it's not just the energy ministry, it's also the transport ministry, the industry ministry, the buildings ministry, depending on how governments organize themselves. Energy efficiency is much more cross-cutting than many parts of energy policy, and I think that's a real challenge. However, I do see some positive signs that governments are starting to recognize the connection between energy efficiency and other socioeconomic goals, particularly economic stimulus and job creation. And one piece of evidence for that is in the next slide. When we measure the global spending commitments to clean energy recovery, so governments who are now making announcements about economic stimulus to recover from the last couple of years, to create jobs, to create economic activity again, the total amount on clean energy, the total amount of recovery spending per se linked to clean energy is not where we would like it to be. But having said that, within the category of clean energy, energy efficiency dominates. 2/3 of announced and mobilized spending to date in clean energy recovery related spending is on energy efficiency. That's building, retrofit, new building, building infrastructure, industrial upgrades, things like that. Things that everybody here knows are job intensive, their economic activity, creating their growth, stimulating. So we see that link being made between the wider multiple benefits of energy efficiency and rather than just energy saving per se. Next slide, please. This is informing some of the work we're doing in different parts of the world, including with key emerging economies who are very, of course, cognizant of these links. So for example, we've been working very closely with the government of India looking at the textile sector, which is actually one of the biggest employment sectors in India, very large numbers of employees, and actually driven by women employees. It's a really important social sector in India, but it's made up of very large numbers of very small operations, each of them not using a lot of energy, each of them not particularly energy intensive, and certainly not particularly energy efficient. So it's a real policy question for the government of India to think about how to engage that sector with a view to enhancing competitiveness, improving gender equality, creating new jobs, as well as the other dimensions. And that's an area we'll continue to focus. So Niels, drawing to a conclusion, I want to mention 3 themes that I really think are important for the next phase of energy efficiency. The first is what I've been dwelling on here, which is the link to net zero. And that has a couple of implications. First of all, never has been a better time for energy efficiency to sell itself in terms of its importance to delivering net zero targets. And I'll state again, I can't see net zero projects, net zero goals being a success if they don't focus very heavily on energy efficiency. And that message needs to be strengthened with analysis, with evidence, but also with solutions, because we all know that many times energy efficiency is being sold as a solution to problems, but governments sometimes find it hard to do, or maybe are sometimes a little bit skeptical about what it'll deliver. And that's why we need to focus on solutions and implementation. And the key opportunity here is net zero itself becomes an organizing principle for governments and for societies. So energy efficiency has a chance to be part of a cross-cutting societal, all of government project much more strongly than it would have in the past, when it was selling itself on its own now, as opposed to this really fundamental societal challenge of net zero. The second key theme, which I think is really important, is in the next slide, which is digitalization. Certainly, I'm of the view that energy systems, and more than any part of energy systems, energy efficiency is really being changed by digitalization. Huge new opportunities for optimization of systems, for much better control of energy use in our appliances, in our buildings, in our communities, but also a new way of thinking about energy efficiency that's thinking not just about end use efficiency, but systems efficiency, making optimal use of clean, cheap resources when they're available, balancing the systems in the context of intermittent variable renewable resources, minimizing investment needs, minimizing system size, system costs, and thinking in a much more dynamic systems way. Huge opportunities there, but a lot of policy challenges to think about how we do things differently, and some challenges, I think, to the efficiency policy community to think in a different way about how we do policy and regulation in that space. Just to say, this is a theme we've been working on quite a lot with a lot of governments. So in the next slide, I'll just give a little plug for some work we did last year, led by the government of Italy, to whom we're very grateful, who were president of the G20 group last year and asked us to do some work with them on smart, sustainable cities, looking at how digitalization is really changing energy efficiency and energy systems at a city level. And that's work we're continuing to do across our efficiency work in the agency. Happy to talk about that further. My third and final, and probably the most important theme in the next slide, is people. We talk a lot about energy efficiency, we talk about energy policy, we talk about devices, we talk about kilowatt hours, we talk about GDP. Sometimes we forget that all energy transitions, all net zero targets are for and about people. They're about mitigating the worst impacts of climate change. They're about making people's lives better, creating jobs, creating wealth, eliminating poverty, providing access to energy. All of this is part of the socioeconomic package of what energy transitions are really about. And we need to keep that central focus. Even more so, we know that if energy transitions are not people friendly, if they're not inclusive, if they're not equitable, if they don't bring benefits to people, they won't maintain public support and they will fail. And that's why we encourage all governments to put a stronger focus on the people dimension of clean energy transitions. And last year, our executive director brought together the Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions to look at exactly this, bringing together a lot of energy climate ministers, a lot of leading thinkers from civil society to really look at how we can make, we can learn from each other in terms of best practice on how to make all of our policies, energy efficiency and beyond, more people-centered and inclusive. And I would commend their work to you. It's all available on our website, their recommendations, plus a nice large data bank of best practice in the area of how to align people goals with energy efficiency goals. So Nina and Niels, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Very happy to take questions and to continue this conversation. Thank you.
Brian, thanks a lot. Brilliant presentation. I think it was really good. Somebody here, we have just very few questions, but we had one that asks you if you're available of the Swiss project Remap, that modeling different net zero scenarios for Switzerland, and you may learn from each other, he says. So I know Switzerland is a member of the International Energy Agency, of course, but there are many projects going on. So maybe it's in the chat if you want to pick up there on that one. I also wanted to say that just before we leave that, with the Global Commission, ECEEE and ACEEE and India's IEA, we did a joint little publication, a short memo about almost 2 years ago, as a feed into that commission, where we gave 12 proposals as well from the energy efficiency expert NGO community. It's translated in 8 languages, I think, and it's on our website. So I think I will put it in the chat so you can download it if you want to. It's still a valid paper, of course, but I think it was brilliant. I'm very happy to see that you were showing that energy efficiency is still picking up and it's getting a lot of good kind of investment. I think we'll come back to how can we increase the appeal of energy efficiency and in policymaker circles, because this is also very much what the Energy Efficiency Watch project is all about. How do you make politicians and policymakers understand that energy efficiency is not, although it's not visible, it's still, our friend Hans Nilsson used to say, it's a very big thing that comes in very small packages. And that's the problem why it's sometimes hard to recognize it, of course. I think we'll continue. I don't have any other clarifying questions from the, but there was one very quick question, light and small enterprises. You say, but how can we encourage them to check up energy efficiency? Because although the potential is large, there is, of course, maybe not always a very large portion of their total cost structure that is related to energy. Do you have something very short to comment there before I hand over to Christiane?
Thanks, Niels. Thank you for those comments. And just to say on the Switzerland example, we are aware of remapping.
It was from Peter Rusko, by the way, it's on my comment. So just, you know.
Yeah, just to say to Frederick's question on Switzerland, we're very aware of that work. Thank you. And in fact, the Swiss energy minister was on the Global Commission this year. We're very grateful for that. To Peter's question, it's a very good question because fundamentally the policies that governments take to look at the small number of large energy users like steel and aluminium, etc., are quite different from the policies you need to deal with a very large number of small industries. There are plenty of good examples. I'm sure colleagues here can relate to them. And I would say just look at our website for the work we've been doing on the textile sector, which we're kind of using as an example. We've done it with India. We're now working on it actually with Brazil as well. It's a very important socioeconomic sector in many emerging economies. And it talks about different types of policies around best practice, training, incentives as well. There are different measures, but it's more challenging for governments to think about. Instead, like in medium-sized countries, you might think about you have a couple of hundred really large energy users. You can get to know them, you can engage them in networking and different things like that. But when you get to small and medium enterprises, you're talking about hundreds of thousands or even millions of small operators. And as Frederick says, and as you said, Niels, they don't tend to be focused on energy efficiency. It's not a big proportion of their spend. They don't necessarily have the skill set. It's not their priority. So the policies are different. I don't want to spend too long now. I'm sure we can discuss it later, but thanks, Niels.
Thank you very much, Brian. We'll come back to the panel when we continue discussing, but I'll then will invite Christiane Ecker. I think also Megan Sinjak from your agency will also present today. I think you will do it together. Is that correct?
I will do it, and Megan will get me back on track if I get derailed.
Okay. Yes, that might be needed sometimes. But I like enthusiasm rather than lukewarm presentation. So, Nina, please open the presentation, and we'll continue with.
I'll just say that I got a suggestion here to mute all, and the speaker should unmute. If that's okay.
Please. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for the invitation, Niels and team. My name is Christiane Ecker. I work for an energy agency in Austria, the Regional Energy Agency of Upper Austria. And before I start my presentation, allow me one comment on the discussion on SMEs, manufacturing SMEs. My region is a highly industrial region with a big steel company that tends to block politicians' minds. Just what Brian has said, but in more polite ways. But we have, in fact, the larger energy consumption is from the hundreds of smaller manufacturing companies. And indeed, we use the policy approach, which I call the sticks, the carrots, and the tambourines, the regulatory, the financial, and the information and the awareness raising, as we do for private homeowners. So it's a separate policy field, and you shouldn't mix, as Brian rightly said, large scale, a small number of very large scale steel, chemical manufacturers with all the SMEs. Now, coming to the subject of my presentation, thank you, Brian, also for giving us the sobering energy efficiency bottom line of last year. Yes, we are aware of that, but also with a vision of where we could be in a couple of years if we can get our act together. And maybe our contribution from the Energy Efficiency Watch project, which I will share with my colleague Daniel, can make a small contribution and maybe provide an explanation for the lack of speed we sometimes see. On my next slide, I will give you just a brief insight into the project. It's a long-going project since 2006. We have worked in a team also together with IEEE on different activities on speeding up energy efficiency policy development and implementation on all levels in the EU. And especially in the ongoing project, we work strongly on developing and testing narratives for the energy transition in member states. On my next slide, I introduce you to the key part of my presentation today, which was the Energy Efficiency Watch survey. As far as I know, one of the largest energy efficiency surveys done. There were more than 1,270 experts from all EU member states participating, answering questions on how they see progress on the ground. As you know, in the EU member states report, and then maybe people who work on the ground see a different picture from what is in the report to the Commission. And also, we wanted to gather insights for narrative development in member states. They came from the different sectors, and on my next slide, you can see they came from all EU countries, and in all countries we had a good response, so that the messages we can give on fairly firm ground. Now, on the next slide, here are some conclusions on the part of the survey, which I'm not showing today, which was on the energy policy progress in the different EU countries. In overall terms, it was just more of the same compared to the previous survey in 2015. We couldn't believe our eyes how similar the development had been, how similar slow, according to the experts. And this was an even larger number of experts, and partly, of course, different experts. So the message is, in the EU, what also Brian said, despite good progress, we remain too slow, and there's the new dynamics which we need cannot be seen. What we also observed is already in the previous watch that there are ups and downs in the levels of ambition across member states. It was the third survey we had been doing. And in some countries, they went up in one survey in terms of ambition and progress, and down on the next, and up in the next one. And if you looked at the specific country, usually it had to do with changes in governments. I think it's fairly obvious. You have a pro-sustainable climate change government, and then you have election or something else happens, and then you have a government who's not interested. However, what we also could see, there were a range of countries where, despite strong changes, these ups and downs were not there, or only very, very minor. So this was a very startling realization, because if you look at the 27 countries over a period, you can easily do an analysis. Where did governments change from left to right, from green to a right wing or whatever, and then correlate this with the changes in policy. And what we found was that in those countries where this did not happen, it seems there was a wider agreement on why these energy efficiencies should be done. And this why is not because Brussels tells us so. You all know this is very popular with our governments. First, they raise their hands in Brussels, and then they come back to their own countries, and then they said, yeah, we are against it, but actually Brussels says we have to do it. I think we are all familiar. So this why is this so-called narratives. Now, what am I talking about? On my next slide, you can see this has to do with the images in people's minds. So these experts here, so one of us here in this room says, Brian or me, we say energy efficiency, and we talk to 3 different people, and one of them thinks, oh, it's about climate. The other thinks it's expensive, and the third thinks, wow, boring, I'm not interested. So clearly, this is about connotations that a certain subject has, and how it echoes and how it resonates with people. Now, with narratives, on my next slide, we create buy-in from wider groups of society by linking the benefits of energy efficiencies with other interesting benefit. I was always very in admiration of the IEA's multiple benefits idea, but I was always very sad that it didn't have a better name. It's such a bureaucratic name. So I was very pleased to hear Brian talking about people-centered goals. And basically this is what narratives and multiple benefits are. So in my example, the first thing's less CO2, because it's a person and her group, they are keen on climate protection. The second thinks, oh, my home will look more modern. And this is something that is very, very important to many people. And the third person may think, I will find a new job. So this is to explain the principle of these narratives, but there's also on my next slide, something you have also encountered, the counter narratives. So I call them killer arguments. So this guy says, let's get serious about the energy transition. And then in people's minds, the first image that pops up is, ooh, our industries will move away, energy prices will rise, and the poor people will disadvantage, and renovating my home doesn't pay off. So we have all encountered this kind of discussion in our private and professional lives. So this is also something to keep in mind when we develop narratives for our respective community, be it a region in my case, or a city, or all IEA countries in Brian's situation. Now, in our survey, we wanted to better understand what constitutes elements of successful narrative. So on my next slide, you can see in terms of the methodology, we wanted to find out which subjects are important in a specific country, in the public debate, in the political debate. And if it's important, it's more likely to resonate. Is energy efficiency linked to any of these topics of high interest in the current debate, and which actor groups are influential and what position do they take on energy efficiency? So I'll go right in on my next slide. Independent of the energy and climate debate, in general, in the media in your country and what politicians are talking about, what are the most important subjects? Surprise, jobs, competitiveness, investments. This is what people see as the most important subject in the political debate in their countries. Now, if we look at these subjects or jobs, you can see other subjects that maybe you or me as an energy efficiency expert often talks and thinks it's the most important people-centered goal. Unfortunately, they don't have this prominence in the public debate that we would like to see. So on my next slide, you can see the result of which of these important subjects is already most linked to energy efficiency, if energy efficiency is on the media or if politicians are talking about. And we can see our big weakness in our sector is we don't link in a sufficient measure job creation to energy efficiency. We are fairly used to talk about energy efficiency and investments, competitiveness to a certain, in some countries more, in others less. But this is, as you see, there is a disconnect in the way we communicate. So on my next slide, you can see also, because this is again about these counter narratives, if energy efficiency is linked to the subject, is it done in a positive or in a negative way? Because that is also fairly important. And as you can see in investments, it's more than half. The debate is negative. So meaning, yes, energy efficiency is expensive, it's costly, and a little bit less than half says it generates investment and is therefore positive. And we have Similarly, for competitiveness, it's much better. For job creations, it's quite good where it is discussed. But so we see there is a lot of homework to be done if we want to put energy efficiency and the energy transition on the level where it should be. Now, second most important, it's important who talks. So we wanted to learn who are the most important influential actor groups on politics in your country, which we can see on the next slide. Ta-da-da! It's the Association of Large Industries. If you think about your own country, you're maybe not surprised. Do we talk a lot in our energy efficiency circles, how we can influence associations of large industries? I have to say that this result of the Association of Large Industries, I've done many surveys in my life, but this was one of the strongest results I've ever seen in my considerable long experience with doing surveys. So it's very clear this is the most powerful group. Trade unions, chambers of commerce, so the second economic actor group, Chamber of Commerce. Tabloid press, interestingly enough, followed by farmers, NGOs, and churches. So why are these groups mentioned here? We did a long pre-check with a lot of pre-surveys, also done, for example, by IEEE, and these came out as groups that at least sometimes that we have a certain consistency across member states in their importance. Now, if we look at the importance of these groups across the EU 27, on my next slide, you can see a very nice picture. So you can see all the EU 27, and in practically all countries with one or two exemptions, industry is number one. And where it's not number one, it's number 2 or 3. Trade unions also fairly important in most countries, followed by Chamber of Commerce. Of course, they don't exist on the same level in many countries. And then we have some small exceptions which are entertaining if you are a politically interested person, like the importance of churches. It's something to read when you want to be entertained. But basically what we see here is this could be a big lever for energy efficiency if we were able to manage to get these highly influential groups on our side. Now, are these groups, these influential groups, what is their positioning on energy efficiency? I will show you on my next slide. On my next slide, you can see that Association of Large Industry, half roughly, with only in 13% of the countries, no clear position. But there was a big difference between some countries, including my own, where and Germany, for example, where Association of Large Industry were really it was a red arrow, whereas in other countries, such as in Nordic countries, it was a fairly long green. So clearly, information is available on the details. And then as we go down, we see how these different groups, but I think it's important not to think about the long bars and not the short bars, because I know that the energy efficiency community enjoys having these discussions, but I think this is one of the messages I wanted to give to you. On my next slide, we have condensed this. So this is what we like to call the key input factors for narrative development. My colleague Megan was extremely effective in assembling this. So we can see clearly jobs, industrial competitive modernization as being important. Then we can see, is this topic already linked to energy efficiency? No, yes, yes. And the large group of the actor groups their influence and their support. This kind of table is available for all EU 27 member states, should you be interested. Now, in my conclusion, on my next slide, starting with my conclusion. So what we have to ask ourselves as a community, are we talking to the right people, and are we talking about the right things in our communication? It's a very inconvenient truth, if I may say so, because we feel all extremely comfortable talking about clean air, and we feel comfortable talking about housing, but we are probably don't feel very comfortable and maybe not empowered to talk to industry. We don't feel empowered to talk about jobs. So I think this is a very important next step. And my conclusions, my conclusion. So the outcome, it's the economy is stupid, as Bill Clinton said, if you are old enough to remember. So we need more attention for jobs, industry, and competitiveness. In order to get buy-in from important stakeholder groups, if we could get that buy-in, that would explain why some member states are not supportive, or it would counteract the non-support also of political groups that so far have not been supportive. Are we talking about the right things to the right people? So we need new messages and new stakeholder interaction to speed up acceptance and participation. We also need, and I've said this to the Commission, and I'm saying this now to the IEA, if we had better data on all this, small energy efficiency experts like me working on the regional, working on the national, if we had better, hard, tough data, like we have for energy data, on that quantify these people-centered benefits, then our lives would be oh so much easier. I know that the ED draft has now some of these numbers, but if we had hard numbers and we had beautiful presentations like IEA has on many other subjects with this people-centered benefits and goals, wow, would this be wonderful. And of course, never waste a good crisis. Now is the time to get energy efficiency and climate protection on board as a recovery strategy, as in the wake of the new COPs. But for that, better narratives would be very helpful. And on my last slide, I would like to propose that when the European Energy Efficiency Directive is adopted, so I hope President von der Leyen will stand up and she will say energy efficiency and the ED bring competitiveness and climate leadership, and then the big guys, unfortunately, will think, so these are representative of large organizations, will think my factories will be more profitable. The trade unions will think there will be many new jobs, and the chambers of commerce will echo our message and say we will sell more energy efficiency products. With that, I'm at the end of my short presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And I hand back to Niels for the next step. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christiane. Brilliant. I've been part of this project, but I'm always happy to hear a new presenter, because you always find new things to kind of, and I really can encourage you all to go to the Energy Efficiency Watch website and download the report, because it contains a wealth of data. As you say, well, you can do the fun thing and look in how important is the church in some countries. I had a question about Croatia, that we should not discuss this in particular now, but I mean,
this is exactly how this discussion gets derailed.
There is fun thing to look at, but there is also really important narratives, and I agree there are some really hard truths. I had a few questions, really clarifying, and one asked about if you can define what you mean by large industry associations, what they are in generically. And
Okay, thank you.
also, it's another question, it goes long, if that also include energy companies and
Yeah,
energy
thank you, Rod,
utilities.
for the question. Hi, Rod. Well, we typically, I would say they do. Typically, thinking about my own country and the political framework, I know in some countries, typically the large, what we used to call utility, are part of the large industry, and often they very much drive the narrative there. Because they were the first ones to, within these organizations, to start a bad narrative, I would say, for the energy transition, because they didn't like it, if you allow me this simplification. So the answer is yes. Of course, nowadays the energy, the electricity industry is a much more varied place, and there are lots of smaller actors which would not belong to these large industry associations, but I would say the large energy companies, the traditional ones, would be included in those, yes.
And also, of course, these are general organizations that not only like it, they can also be like the Association of Steel Manufacturers, but also the general business trade, almost like trade chambers of commerce in some countries, but like Business Europe, but on the national level.
Indeed,
right.
Yeah.
Yes.
But typically in Business Europe, if you look at their membership, you will see it's a mix of large industry associations and large chambers of commerce.
I also had one thing very quickly comment by Didier that the narrative about decarbonization is easier to be performed for residential transport rather than industries and services. And I don't know, do you have a
I work on this every day on the energy transition in industry. It's one of my big subjects personally. I think the value proposition is there. We have just many, and I've been forced to sharpen my let's say our box of policy instruments, because we are an industrial region and a very industrial country. So we do have a big portfolio of policy instruments for the business sector in general. And maybe in some other countries, this is not the case yet. But I would say the sales arguments of the energy transition, if you look, I was in a meeting with large companies a couple of days ago, and one of them said, haha, I look at the rising gas and oil prices and I think, wow, my energy efficiency project and my conversion to renewables, is this not great? So now there's no time like now with exploding electricity or gas prices to get also large industry thinking. Clearly the pathways are not that obvious, but as Brian said, it's really important to segment these markets into these really big, extremely difficult to decarbonize industries like steel, large chemical, and the big millions of mids and smaller sized manufacturing companies where the solutions are there. They just need to be implemented and promoted with the right programs.
Thank you. Brilliant. I think this was a particularly good cue over to Daniel's presentation, because Daniel has been working with focus group with industry and business companies and stakeholders to see how they, in particular, what can we do to have them more interested in what sort of narratives. So I'll simply hand over to you, Daniel, and let you present your part. As you know, this is also part of the Energy Efficiency Watch project. So,
excellent, Niels. Thank you very much. Yeah. Next slide, please. So, right to step into it, like Christiane said, we have been working on monitoring progress since 2006, 2007. Just to cut it short here, the difference between 2007 and today is the question by the time was, will it be possible to cover the complexity of energy efficiency by policy instruments? So not only big and standardizable potentials like in the building sector or so, but really the complexity, for example, in industry applications. The answer is today that we can clearly give is, yes, we can. The EU 27 has succeeded in developing good energy efficiency policies. So there is a very rich and large toolbox in place, providing a lot of good practice. But as Christiane said, often the political will is lacking, and often this is then sort of yeah, it brings up phrasing like, yeah, we have to, Brussels is telling us, but we don't see it in the core of our national interest. So we will only do what is necessary, minimum requirements, etc. Like Christiane showed in the survey, this was a very aggregated compilation of opinions, of contributions. And what we have been doing since Watch 3 successfully is also hear very individual and pointed voices from the business communities, as they have to work with regulation. So we wanted to hear their opinions, and in Watch 4, then in particular on narratives. So which narratives they come across that help their business ideally, or that impede it, and by understanding it, what is really counterproductive, you can understand better how to possibly turn this. So we have collected 10 case studies, next slide please, which I'm going to quickly present you. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, thank you, there it is. So those are the 10 narrative cases from the business stakeholder workshops. One word on the business stakeholder workshops, they were planned to take place live in 10 selected EU member states. Of course, due to the pandemic, we had to change that to online formats, which was less lively, but still brought a lot of very fascinating insights. And each narrative collected here was brought up by more than one country. So that was a precondition, that this was not just an individual opinion or statement coming from one country context, but we could see a broader picture. The first one, wanting to be a front runner, is a very general positive narrative approach. Like Christiane said, we discovered that in some country contexts, when there are, for example, changes in government or so, there's a more stable environment still for energy efficiency. So the new government, even if it's composed of different parties, don't change everything that has been established by their predecessors, because there is in the background a narrative in place. Often that narrative goes, sometimes more, sometimes less pronounced, in a way like, it is good for us as a nation, it is good for us to be a front runner on energy efficiency, maybe also on other topics. We see this in the core interest of our nation, and therefore we implement it. No matter what Brussels tells us, we see it strongly within our own favor. So that is a very strong and sort of the ideal positive narrative that you can imagine. The second one, that is a more complex one, energy efficiency as integral optimization of the production cycle. I want to give a bit of background on that. We can, if there is time, come back to that more in detail. I have a separate slide on that. But here quickly in an overview, speaking mainly to a round of energy auditors, they said often our audits are just considered as a piece of paper that has to be stamped. So we need to sort of manage the threshold that people really read what we can bring up, but not only in terms of the savings that are possible, but more in the sense of how the whole production cycle of goods, especially when complex manufacturing steps are involved through digitization even more, there is a lot of optimization potential going beyond the mere saving of units of energy. And if that message is brought across and is within the company, taken up by the right people at board level, etc., we manage not only to get attention for the subject, but sort of really take it to a next level at the core of competitiveness, of real optimization. So that was something we found particularly interesting, and that was then brought up by several other workshop participants in different country contexts, saying, yes, if we can make legislation on audits more pronounced on sort of who has to do what with it. Is it just a stamped paper that you can then put into a folder, or are we getting it to an energy management system or so? That will be a big step. Just in brief here, maybe we have time to come back to that. Then number 3, only talk about a real business case that is dealing with the multiple benefits, if you want. So business stakeholders here said that due to their experience, there was a very clear understanding with their clients, but also with their fellow business people about what made a business case and what not. And they said often a dilemma is that the business cases you find in energy efficiency are niches of the business, which you can't really expand because of counterproductive surroundings. So cheap energy prices, structural advantages for less efficient solutions, etc. And they said, and we found that as a warning in terms of communication, very interesting. They said a trap you can get into is if you try then to sort of pimp up a bit the weakish business case by some additional green features. That is a temptation that many that you see often, but they said, I don't sell anything more. It's just it's a marketing element that I can use on top of something that is viable, but I don't get things above the threshold of commercial viability just by using those green arguments. So they said there's a fine line, and it's more important really to work on the political framework to create more robust business cases, and then use the nice green on top arguments as marketing. So that was the subtle but very clear message in that one. I think that is worth a discussion and some further thought. Number 4, I'm going quicker due to lack of time. Transparent foundations for energy efficiency achievements. So many people said in various country contexts that it was difficult to communicate clearly about the measurable achievements because everybody was literally using their own data. So even though statistical data may be there, it is often not clearly proven in the public debate, in the press, etc., with interest groups, with stakeholder groups, which information is how relevant, for example, about costs, additional costs of energy efficiency versus payback times. So people said that often opened in their respective contexts the door for all sorts of erroneous or even fake news. And a lot of additional attention was needed to clarify what was trusted and proven information on the achievements. And that was actually much better than often in public perception. So also that is something relevant for the future of communicating energy efficiency. Number 5, understand your clients, work with the image of technologies. That is referring to things like the nice advertisement that Christiane has in her background. Adieu Öl is a campaign from Upper Austria, working here with the negative image for old-fashioned oil heating. So often it is not a primary aspect how much funding you give people for switching to a new technology, but also you have to know a bit about their backgrounds, like is money really their first problem, or is it more that they need an additional push in terms of what is fashionable, what is sort of otherwise in their interest? There were also other examples, one very prominent from Slovenia, where people said heating with wood would normally be very logical in the country context. However, modern gas heating and heat pumps were more popular because they were more associated with modernity. So that was an aspect where people said, if we want to foster that, really, we need to work much more with the image of technologies, that they don't have a sticker on, like saying in people's minds, hey, this is somehow attached to backwardness, to old-fashioned stuff that reminds us of some unwanted aspects of our past or so. Number 6, just transition. That is a very important topic in the public debate. Here, interesting critical aspects about the nuances of how to communicate on just transition. People said it is a bit problematic to link those two terms, just and transition, so closely, because it may imply, it may be misunderstood as if a transition was only something desirable if it was made just. If the just wasn't added, it would therefore be unjust or so. So that all sorts of exaggerated claims for compensation were coming up in the debate. Controversial topic, but interesting case for making a narrative and for continuing the public debate. Then number 7, communication is key, the role of stakeholder dialogues. In many country contexts, stakeholders said that there was a perceived disconnect between implementation or non-implementation of regulation coming from Brussels or at the national level, and actually the needs on the ground. So there was a clear ask for more dialogue formats, early stage, but also in the process of what was planned in terms of implementing, how that would match or not match actual demands among the business stakeholder community, but also in the population, etc. So parliamentary hearings, maybe at the highest level, but also citizen dialogues, that was a strong plea. In some contexts, this is more common than in others, but across the European Union, it became obvious there is quite a deficit on formats like those still. Number 8, research and innovation. That was also very interesting for us to see. People said that often policies about research and innovation were decoupled from energy transition. So in the research landscape of certain countries, you could find rather a focus on outdated technologies, underestimating. So the picture that this would give was an underestimation of the innovation potential of new technologies. So the plea here was to couple the two more together and be aware of the effect on popularizing new technologies if research institutions were committed to them and could show the economic and innovative potential for countries. Number 9, the right pace for workforce qualification, that is dealing, of course, with something familiar, I think, to all of us, that if you look at the building sector or other relevant sectors, often the qualification of staff is lagging significantly behind for implementing new technologies, which also has a significant image building impact if people are not up to date, negative image building. So selling old heating systems or not promoting building insulation or other technologies in the right way because the stakeholders don't know how to properly install it. Number 10, who is price sensitive and how to discuss cost distribution. This is targeting CO2 tax systems, for example, and the compensation means. So what was to be seen is that often the debates take weird turns, the public debates, when it comes to who has to be compensated for what, at which amount. Will the compensation actually cover the additional cost that has to be borne by certain parts of the population, etc. This is very complex. The calculation examples are very complex. So also here, a lot of additional communication and positive narratives have to be established. So this is an overview. I guess, Niels, looking at the clock, we rather have a bit of discussion than go into these examples more deeply, but we can probably do that in the Q&A. So these are the cases we have. They are, of course, based on subjective, rather individual perspectives, but that is what we wanted to complement the survey, which, like Christiane pointed out, gives a very aggregated and broad stakeholder overview. With that, over to you, and happy to receive questions.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I am. I have one, for instance, I got one specific question, I think, which could be linking into this, and there's a person saying, I'm a researcher and I work with big industries on heat pump integration and efficiency projects. So he often gets into touch with engineers, and it's hard for that person to reach to, let's say, the decision making or the management level, where like investment committee or those people who do the decisions. I think this is, of course, not unique. This was actually an integrated feature of the multiple benefits project we were running. Exactly how do we move this into a strategic part of the company's strategic values? So I think this is very closely linked.
Can I make a comment on that, Niels?
Yes.
Because I'm running an initiative which
I know
does exactly
you are.
this. It's called Energy Transition Leaders, and it regroups 15 of these manufacturing companies that we have discussed. So 1,500, 2,000 people, mid-size, normal, normal in the sense of their size. And what we have learned from this, and these are all pioneers in the energy transition. They have given themselves the goal of achieving climate neutrality, and they want to strategically address this. And what we learn is we need 2 levels for this transition to be fast. We need the engineers, because the engineers knows what is needed from a technical point of view, and we need the management. So I think I've seen many companies where, for example, the CEO was keen on saying, yeah, let's do something. And then he went back to his facility manager, and this facility manager said, blah, 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 blah. So I think these 2-level approach, and we will see someone mentioned the taxonomy in the chat. We will see a lot of push on management level, especially CFOs. From the taxonomy, and when companies will suddenly have to declare their CO2 footprint, then when they want to get a loan from their bank. However, we need to empower both the companies, the technicians, and the CEOs to get the right decisions. So it's about empowerment and motivation, and they need quite different policy instruments to make that happen.
Thank you. So yeah, this is I think it's a really good point that sometimes really people who want to do something are being put off by their say people who are on the factory floor or wherever they are. So, no, we tried this, or I don't want to risk anything, don't I? So, I mean, there are small popes around and small kingdoms in every bigger organization where people protect their borders very, very jealously. I think this is a big problem. We have a number of and as always with these seminars, the chat just rolls on and questions go high and low and to the left and right, and it's really hard to pick out some interesting things. But I would like to start out with one thing on really going back to the narratives as well. And I think one thing is, of course, positive narratives, to understand it. But Brian, when you presented your slides, and you had one slide from COP26, and you said about the SEED group, the super efficient appliance development initiative, which I think is great. I've been working on that before, so I'm happy to see it's being still, I wouldn't say still alive, but somebody has made it wake up again, which is wonderful. Anyway, there was a picture from a presentation on the wall. I think it was Fatih Birol standing in front of it. I don't remember exactly. And it says super efficient appliance development initiative, and is a big picture of wind power and PVs. So we, even the energy efficiency community, we struggle with to make an image. Even we are the experts to make images of how to depict energy efficiency. And I think it's partly part of this problem that we are very stuck with energy supply, renewables that are easily seen, and energy efficiency is more under the hood of appliances and equipment. Do you have a thought on this, the panel, Christiane or Daniel or Brian? How do we really move towards visualizing energy efficiency as well? I see this all the time. Green. Maybe it's ignorance of graphic designers. I don't know, but then we don't instruct them well enough.
Do you start, Brian? Yes.
Sure. You're right. I just noticed that image. I should have looked at that more closely. But there's a washing machine just behind.
No, I'm happy you had it. Okay, those.
Yeah, you just can't see it because the solar panel's in the way. But anyway, when I talk to senior policymakers, Niels, about energy efficiency, the most common comment I get, and this is global, is there's nothing for my minister to cut a ribbon on. There's a real tangibility issue here around what energy efficiency looks like. Having said that, let me say two things. One is, from a consumer perspective, just taking this example about appliances, I'm not really interested in ever using the word efficiency with a consumer. If we talk about, an efficient washing machine or something, you're talking about a device that costs half as much to run as it did a couple of decades ago, and it's actually cheaper to buy than ever. So there's a very strong messages you can give to consumers there. And I think, the work on labeling and standards and all that standards and labels really work, and they really have made a difference in the appliance sector. And we did some work on that last year with the 4E TCP that is really quite, clear how much gains have been made in a very tangible way in terms of people's pockets and people's energy bills and overall energy demand. More generally, as I said in my remarks earlier, I think net zero creates a new opportunity, because if you're talking to governments, we're now in a position just to really kind of, and I don't think this is denied, the importance of energy efficiency, the need for energy efficiency. Sometimes I feel that governments don't disagree that efficiency has these benefits in theory, but they worry about delivering them in practice. So I think we shouldn't just always talk about selling efficiency as a shiny object that somebody wants to buy. We need to tell them how to buy it, install it, and use it and maintain it. So we shouldn't just talk about benefits in terms of, in theory, efficiency can give you these things. I think for a long time, governments have known that in theory, but struggled with the in practice part. And I would emphasize that helping governments understand how to implement and really get the results, not just, you know, telling them in advance you could in theory save this. I think it really needs more emphasis, as well as just get them engaged with the potential benefits, but don't leave it there. Just, you know, support the governments to really deliver, and that means monitor, enforce, you know, trace over time, strengthen policies over time. That whole journey needs to be part of it, not just the initial selling part.
Well, I can add maybe 2 points here. One is we work with end consumers on a daily basis. So more and more we use what Daniel said, modernization, because we find even the oldest and really most conservative people, they also want to be modern, interestingly enough. So in our terminating fossil fuel heating campaign, we talk a lot about being not modern anymore. And it's amazingly effective. So this is on the image side, and on the other side, what we see now and what we've seen a long time. If you have an end goal like net zero or climate neutrality, as we call it, then as a government or as a company, immediately when you start looking at your renewable options, you find you can't do it with them alone. So I've seen whenever there is a very, very strong target that is clear and that is evident, then people start calculating, and they start calculating with their renewable options. And then, which is great and good, but soon they come to a point where they see the renewables alone will not be able to do it. So I have a lot of hope in this field.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, surprisingly, no sort of different view or so, but I think regarding the visualization, the sort of smart systemic approaches it is possible to visualize them. So there has been, I think, one of the, well, not mistakes, but one of the things we need to get across is that there has been too much focus on sort of thriftiness of in terms of energy efficiency. So assuming that people would be so keen on saving kilowatt hours, whilst the kilowatt hour per se is pretty abstract, and then even the saving, you can't see it, and the measurement is not such that you can really detect what have I saved or so. But what is very convincing, if it is presented in an appealing way, is the smartness of a system. So combining renewables and efficiency, or a domestic, a smart home, not the fancy stuff about it, but actually if it is presented at a video screen in the right way, what is happening when, and where are really the intelligent aspects to it also. So I think if we manage to popularize that more, that will be a big achievement. And that is then closely connected to being modern, wanting to get rid of the outdated stuff. So if you also look at aesthetics, it's often by the car industry or by other classical machine building, often the aesthetic of a actually outdated technological feature is iconic, and we need to replace that by something. So that is maybe an approach how to work with the visualization more. And we can see that more and more, but we need to understand what's behind it. What are the mental triggers for people here?
Thank you. It's very interesting. I have some other comments also on that's more specifically into business, of course, and I want to come back, so we end also with more with policy and policymakers. But I have some things that comes to business, and there are a number of questions on this, and I'd just like you to pick up. I think you could do something short on this. One is about things such as energy efficiency networks that are about like peer-to-peer to to create confidence. I know that can be organized in many different ways, but to create a structure where companies learn and help each other. Another thing that's come up is, and I think that relates to one of your bullet, whatever number that was, but about confidence in terms of what you do, and again, to institutionalize the method to save energy. So energy management systems are really important, and perhaps they shouldn't be too complicated. That's also a very important thing to let's say to make this practice. So small companies and maybe up to medium-sized companies, they do this as a kind of common practice. Any thoughts about this peer-to-peer and confidence creating and making it a structure in the business? Just, you know, very short, all the three of you, please. You can start, Daniel, because you are nodding the most
I can do that
eagerly.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The peer-to-peer plays a key role here, and I think a sort of an overarching benefit for everybody recognizing this is the mutual learning, is the is discovering we are stronger if we are doing this jointly, if we recognize jointly that we depend on, for example, also transparent data foundation. It should be in the public interest. It is not something random that a statistical office publishes and nobody cares or so, but it is really something that matters, that we need to communicate our successes, that we need to share our experience, that we need to understand jointly the progress from which everyone will benefit. And that is not sort of a business secret, but it is really something to be shared with society, and that can be then associated with a certain image also for your company. But I think here, the transparency of data foundations and thus the achievements through energy management systems, through using audit results smartly, is closely connected, and I think we need to recognize that. Therefore, that would be my suggestion how to go about this further.
Brian?
There's a lot of good policy learning around the world, Niels, and I agree with what the colleagues are saying. I guess the only point I would add is that it really does change when you go down the scale ladder in terms of energy intensity and energy spend. And for larger companies, things like networks and peer-to-peer learning are really important. As a company gets smaller and their energy gets a bit smaller, getting any of their attention time becomes very difficult for understandable reasons. A very small company that spends a few €1,000 on energy, even a few tens of thousands of euros, and it's 1 or 2% of their costs or whatever, it would be irrational for them to spend much management time in this compared to other things. And therefore you need tools like, first of all, the technology they're buying should be super efficient. That should be a minimum through standards and other mechanisms. Energy management systems designed for the right scale and the right type of context should be there. And those kind of mass instruments, we can't rely on everybody waking up someday and getting enthusiastic about energy efficiency and spending time thinking about it. It's got to be built into technology, infrastructure, management systems, all of that kind of thing. And particularly as we go to the large number of smaller firms, we need to think in those terms. Maybe.
But Brian, just a quick follow-up question on this. I mean, if you have companies that work together in networks, it doesn't necessarily have to be the main focus. Energy efficiency, the focus could be around other things, energy efficiency income. So as long as there is a benefit a perceived benefit that you know outweighs your cost of participating, maybe then you could get energy efficiency part of this whole peer-to-peer learning. It's not just going there, but not a network of only energy management or managers, because such small companies won't even have an energy manager, of course. Christiane.
Well, I'm, as I said, market segmentation is key. There's one thing which is the large companies, there's the mid-size, and there's the small companies, and they are three very different things. As has been said, the small companies, I find we can reach them here in our region relatively easily because there are many programs for homes. And usually you are not that far away from the scale and the thinking. So we often reach people through our residential programs. And then people say, oh yeah, I have a business as well, 10 people in my hairdressers. Can you also help me with that? So this is one thing. Then peer-to-peer learning happens locally in the village, in the local context. So we go out as an agency and hold events, not now, but soon again, hopefully, in the mid-afternoon for these small business owners. So this is also something, and I think many EU countries and many regions, they don't have a policy that takes into account these differentiations between the types of companies. As if you look at the EED draft, I was really not so happy to see pages and pages about public buildings and lots of new articles. And if you look at the new ideas for the business sector, it's not that much there. So I think the fantasy and the ideas on how to tackle business needs just more policy attention. And the business sector, if we look at the EU sector, the residential sector has, rightly so, an enormous attention, and the large industry has their own attention, but everything in between, there's not much. So I think this is also something we should all advocate for. And this event, Niels, is your contribution to triggering this debate. And lastly, I would like to say that in general for energy efficiency, I think we can learn a lot from commercial brands, because what do commercial brands do? They give you confidence. There was a lot of discussion about confidence in the chat, that this product is a good product. If you buy a brand that you like or you trust, part of the brand promise is this has this kind of qualities that I would like to have. And it comes with perceived benefits outside the direct use of the product. So of being cool, modern, whatever. So I think we should really think more in these terms for energy efficiency. And I totally agree the visualization something leaves to be hoped for. And I would like to end by inviting you all to the European Energy Efficiency Conference that we will hold on 7th and 8th of April. My colleague will put the link into the chat should you not have heard. Brian has just agreed to be there. I've just browbeaten him. And we hope to see many of you there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we are already beyond time. I would like to ask the three other panelists to say as one thing, what you really would like to see happening in terms of getting policymakers pick up on energy efficiency narratives. What would you like to hear during 2022? Not your promise, but your wish for 2022. What would you like, Christiane?
Well, I showed you a picture about President von der Leyen. That was my wish, that when she talks, and she's actually relatively good on narratives and on industrial narratives because she's German and she's got a lot of pressure from that field, but really that the whole policymaker area that is in the energy field would stop saying, oh, it also creates jobs. They also don't say, oh, it saves energy, but it says it saves so many gigajoules and so many tons of CO2. But on the data side, how many jobs, how it does improve our competitiveness. If they could mention these data, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. Brian.
Thanks, Niels. So it's great to see the momentum towards net zero targets. Those ambitions are welcome and they're very necessary, but let's see the action. Let's see governments turning their aspirations into real concrete plans, not in 2026 or 27, but in 2022. And let's see that in an integrated way where they're thinking about the best policies that bring the maximum wide benefits to their citizens. They deliver the fastest and cheapest and most robust emissions reductions. And they do so in a whole of government integrated way. And if that logic is pursued, then energy efficiency is bound to be front and center. There's no other rational approach. Thank you.
Not everybody understands that it needs to be front and center, even though they speak about it very much. I just know many examples from, we have the high electricity price crisis in Sweden, and the daily industrial newspaper listed 5 reasons why we have so high prices. But one of those things were not, that energy efficiency wasn't even mentioned. We could have done much more, so that's typical. Daniel, your wishes for 2022.
I would wish for a more positive communication saying, yes, we can, and yes, it will be good for us.
Thank you. So I thank you all who have participated. We are now down at 66 people, but I was very happy to see that we were up above 110 participants at the most during the presentation. So this is really great. I am really happy to see such a good turnout. And I also would really like to thank everybody who joined and took part. We'll try to have more webinars, but not so many that you get tired of us. I also, of course, would like to thank our eminent speakers, Christiane Ecker from Upper Austria. We have Daniel Becker from Guidehouse, physically in Berlin, right? And we have Brian Motherway from IEA, physically in Paris. It's nice actually to mention where people are physically, because otherwise, that's we're still humans with bodies, right? So very, very good to have you all on board. As we told you in the beginning, the seminar is recorded. We'll make the recording and the presentations available shortly, so you can also share it with other people. And there also will be a short, that will take some more time, a short narrative report, picking up on the highlights of this, so we can publish as well. Thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll keep this screen open for a bit. Also the chat, if you want to pick up on any of the, there were a lot of very interesting and good links to various projects and papers and stuff coming up now. So feel free to roam this and pick up what you want directly instead of waiting for the final report. So we'll keep the window open for a while. But thank you everyone so much, and I wish you all a pleasant evening. Or I think most of you are in Europe anyway. So I see that we have people both from Japan and US. So great, thanks a lot, and see you next time.